Hello and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has admitted that economic sanctions used against countries by the United States put the dollar's dominance at risk. What she didn't say is that the dollar's dominance is not simply at risk, but is diminishing at record pace. As the United States has continued to weaponize the dollar, countries are seeking alternatives, from creating new common currencies to using local currencies. Nations are trying to find a safe and equitable way to trade instead of being at the whims of a hegemon, which can decide overnight to confiscate a country's money or cut it off from the international financial system. How close is King Dollar to being dethroned? Well, stay with us on this Spotlight as we will look at all of this. I'd like to welcome my guests to the program. John Edmonds, Professor of Finance at Babson College, Wellesley, Massachusetts. And Richard Beck, anti-war activist from the Answer Coalition out of San Francisco. Thank you both for being with me. I'd like to start this off with John. Is it a sign of just how bad the overall situation is when the U.S. Secretary actually admits that the dollar's dominance is at risk? And why do you think that she has said this at this time in this way?
Well, first of all, the dollar has a position which is relatively dominant, but not absolutely. It was intended, the Bretton Woods system was intended to be similar to the pound sterling gold standard, which worked from about 1700 to about 1914, but never really achieved that degree of total market share. But right now we have a couple things going on which could be quite devastating for the dollar. One is that the House of Representatives might not raise the debt ceiling, and that would lead to defaulting on the Treasury bonds. And the other thing is that we are seeing a number of initiatives for creating an alternative international currency. Most recently, I've heard about China, India, and Brazil getting together to create one unified currency.
Okay, well, Richard, now Janet Yellen downplayed the actuality of the deterioration of the dollar and a number of countries looking for an alternative foreign exchange reserve. Richard, how serious do you see this situation for the United States?
Well, I think that we can see just from the fact that Janet Yellen is talking about this, shows that instead of not being worried, she's very worried about it. And the government is very worried about this. And I think that it's worth mentioning, your other guests mentioned Bretton Woods. Back in 1944, as World War II came to an end, the policymakers in Washington were putting together the plan for how the United States would become the new global hegemon. This would be the U.S. empire, displacing the British Empire. And the basic elements of that were to search out and find resources all over the world, secure resources all over the world, which the U.S. was doing while the war was still going on, and particularly the resource oil, which was the most important, to maintain a strong military, not to demobilize the military as had been done after previous wars, but to maintain a worldwide set of bases, and also to use the United Nations as a means that they hoped, and it didn't quite turn out this way, but that would be a means of global diplomatic political hegemony as well. And the dollar, the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, created the World Bank and the IMF, both under U.S. control, and made the dollar basically the world currency.
Well, John, the reality is that 59% of the world's exchange reserves are dollars. Do you think countries can easily create an alternative to the greenback after it being dominant since basically after the war?
Well, easily has not actually worked. I mean, it's very feasible. They could do it tomorrow morning or today. Today's not over yet, but it would require some actions which other countries have been unwilling to take. If you go back to the 1980s, the Japanese yen was touted as an alternative to the dollar. The Japanese did not want that role for their currency. And then when the euro came in at the end of the 90s, it was said that the euro would replace the dollar, and again, it did not. and we then had the Chinese yuan as a replacement for the dollar. And China has not wanted to do that because they would have to allow free trading of their currency vis-a-vis other currencies, and they have a kind of exchange control in effect, which would not be, they could still do it, but they just haven't done it. And the commentator is entirely correct that the Bretton Woods Agreement and the International Monetary Fund attempted to install the U.S. in the position that the United Kingdom had had prior to World War I, and for a while it worked, but it's not working these days. So time to go back to the drawing board.
Well, why would you say? You said it's not working these days, John. What would you say are the main problems with it? Why isn't it working any longer?
I would say the number one problem in the U.S. right now is lack of consensus about whether or not we would like to have, to take the extreme position, whether we would like to have paper money. Would we like to have a central bank? Would we like the dollar to have the role that it has? There's an element within the House of Representatives that would really like to eliminate the internet. Not just the Federal Reserve, but also the International Monetary Fund. And it seems to me, from what they're saying and the way they've been acting, they'd like to go back to gold and silver coins, which would be a little too exciting. I think it'd be very, very hard to deal with.
Well, Richard, in your perspective, why has the United States weaponized the dollar via sanctions? In reality, hasn't it simply shot itself in the foot because countries can no longer trust the dollar not being used against them if they choose to go against Washington's policies?
Well, I think unfortunately the sanctions policy and the use of sanctions so widely as the U.S. is doing, and that's facilitated by the dollar being the world currency, has caused great destruction, immense human suffering, especially in smaller countries, weaker countries that are subject to sanctions. Like I would say Cuba, which is an island, and Cuba is cut off from basically all international trade, not entirely, but to a very large degree. And Cuba's suffering, the people in Iran are suffering, the people in Venezuela are suffering, the people in many countries are suffering as a result of the domination of the U.S. and the domination of the U.S. in the world financial system that allows them to continue the U.S. to continue to wreak havoc and cause so much suffering in so many countries in the world. But I do think that there's a rising movement in the world, and along with the multipolarity that is emerging and has emerged, in fact, I think a movement to put an end to this kind of domination and really against these kind of terrible sanctions, which are inflicting so much pain on so many people.
Let's look at another factor here. Saudi Arabia, John, is starting to sell oil in other currencies besides the dollar. Tell me about the significance of this move.
Well, I would broaden it to say not only Saudi Arabia, but a great many other countries have acting in a very understandable way, have tried to defend their own interests and not be puppets at the end of a string controlled by Uncle Sam. And the problem that the other countries are seeing is the United States does not speak with one voice. So we say that we're going to do something, and then suddenly it turns out that there's some disagreement. For example, continuing to fund the war in Ukraine. That seems to be hanging in the balance along with a number of other government expenditure priorities. And if you're the chief of state of a country in the Persian Gulf or anywhere else, you want to talk to one person in Washington and get the answer, and that's the answer, and it's not supposed to change, and it's not working that way these days. And that's you mentioned Cuba. Cuba hasn't done anything to the United States in quite a long time, but the weighted voting system in America gives excessive influence to the voters of Florida, and they have a senator whose number one issue is Cuba. And as long as he's there, Cuba will never get back into the international trading system. regardless of what they might do in the past 50 years.
In actuality, we can say Cuba didn't do anything against the United States. It was actually the United States who did a lot against Cuba. But back to you.
Yeah.
And not just once either. But then you should also mention El Salvador and Panama, which use the dollar, and Ecuador also uses the dollar. And they would really like to have a currency where they would have some sovereignty over it, some possibility of issuing their own currency and financing things which are beneficial in their calculation, but they can't do that because they have to use the dollar, and they are not going to be able to get back to that very quickly, get back to their own national currency.
Yeah, Richard, with China, Russia, Brazil, India, and Iran, and many other countries doing some trade now, local currencies are the yuan. Do you see this as the end of the reign of the dollar?
Well, I hope so. I really do hope so, because that reign, the reign of the dollar and the position of the United States in the world, especially since the end of World War II, when it emerged as the country that had not been damaged, had not suffered, what other countries had during the war, and dominated world production, dominated world financial markets. The results of that domination have been so destructive to so many countries. It's just, the list is a long, long list. It's not few countries. It's many, many, many countries have suffered as a result of this kind of domination, as the smaller and weaker countries always do, no matter what empire it is that's ruling. And so I hope it's the beginning of the end of the empire.
Well, what would that mean? Richard, sorry to jump in here. You said you hope that it's the end of the dollar reign. What would it mean for the average American, the American lifestyle, if this is the end of the dollar reign?
Well, I think along with it should go a tremendous reduction, say, in military spending. I mean, the official Pentagon budget is $858 billion this year. The real budget is well over $1 trillion. There needs to be a different system in the world, and there needs to be an end to like having 800 U.S. military bases around the world. What are they doing there?
Right.
Why are there U.S. commands for every single part of the world? This is not good for the people of the United States. So I don't think the people of the United States will suffer. I think that the government and those in power want us to believe that that's true. I don't think it's true at all. I think we would benefit from an end to this system and an end to the way the world affairs are being conducted out of Washington now.
Well, John, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman has said. Oh, go ahead. You want to say something?
I would certainly agree that the U.S. could benefit on a number of time horizons, but the immediate way in which the dollar would be knocked off the fence is by not raising the debt ceiling, and that would lead to a financial crisis, which would be quite serious, really kind of hard to scope out all the interrelated effects, and lots of countries would suffer, but then the recovery from that would be a different scenario than what we have been in. But the other countries really could get together and they could unify and have a common currency similar to the euro. That could be done, and then that could be put into a position of relative prominence compared to what has been done up until now. And that's what I'm expecting to see in the coming weeks, because somebody's got to do something to replace the dollar, and they got to do it really fast, because it looks like the dollar is kind of taking itself out of its traditional role.
So you're expecting major changes, you said, within the coming weeks?
Well, yes, because we're coming up against the debt ceiling, and the way that works is the Treasury cannot issue any more Treasury bonds, which means that they would be unable to pay bonds that are maturing and other bills that they're supposed to be paying, and they couldn't borrow the money because that would exceed their debt limit once again. So what's happening is there's a bunch of people in the House of Representatives who really want to cut government programs, but cut government programs which many of them already voted for. So they want to retract money which has already been earmarked to be spent, and this is one way to do it. This will work, but in a way which is going to have unintended consequences. And maybe worse in the short run for the countries that are still relying on the dollar as their national currency, like El Salvador, which is, I've been there. It's a sad story. Too bad that they lost the possibility of having their own currency. They made such a mess of that they finally had to abandon it. Likewise, Ecuador, I was also there, not at the time, but subsequently. And you pull out a $20 bill and people faint. They have not seen that much money in one place in a lifetime. And that's not correct. I mean, the standard of living in those countries is much higher than the metrics that you could calculate would indicate. You buy an ice cream cone and it costs 60 cents, when in America that same ice cream cone would be $4. And that's what happens. And that, nobody wanted that, least of all the people that are in the middle of it in those countries.
Yeah, indeed. Many people have suffered across the world from this dollar reign and being weaponized. Well, Richard, the dollar hasn't been backed by gold since 1971. And since that time, the U.S. has basically backed the dollar with its military might, meaning if countries threaten to try to use an alternative or go against American foreign policy, they would be in trouble. Now, with the dollar plummeting, how likely are we to see more military action by Washington to try to prevent this?
Well, I think that that's part of the larger issue of U.S. domination in the world. And I think that you are correct in proposing that the way they're trying to do that is by military means. And I think this was not the first time this has happened. So in the late 1970s, when there were a number of revolutions around the world, there was a debate in Washington, 1979-80. It led to Cyrus Vance resigning as Secretary of State, and it was over whether or not the U.S. should accept a lesser position in the world. That position lost out, and there was a huge military buildup under Reagan, and a reassertion of U.S. domination, which really came into being fully with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s. I think that the extreme aggressiveness in regard to Ukraine, and really, you know, today they started nuclear weapons war games, as they're called, mislabeled, in Europe. This is very dangerous, very, very dangerous. The danger of new war, of a nuclear war that could bring an end to life on the planet, is very real. But it's extreme adventurism in Washington to use military means to reassert U.S. domination.
And John, really quickly, although it's a complex answer, I understand, but we're running out of time. Have we entered a new world order, or are we transitioning to one? And if so, how would you describe this new world order?
I would rather use the phrase non-centric, that is, say, no dominant power in the world. That would work a lot better than the first world, second world, third world paradigm that we suffered under for so many years. And also mentioning the collapse of the former Soviet Union, now Russia really taking itself out of the world economy and squandering its blood and treasure, as the phrase goes. I would say we're not going to be in a bipolar world either, because that's not the way to think about it. The way to think about it is we're all in this together, and we have a lot of problems. Namely, I greatly appreciate the thought about the possible nuclear war. That is not something to mess around with. And also, climate is not something to mess around with. And for some short-term political objective or getting elected in a particular election is a really bad act of statesmanship on the part of many people in positions of authority. They really ought to take a wider scope and think of the world and think of what their actions would do besides out of their own little narrow constituency. And
on that note, I'd like to thank both of you for being with me. We're out of time. John Edmonds, Professor of Finance, Babson College, Wellesley, Massachusetts. Richard Becker, anti-war activist from Answer Coalition out of San Francisco. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashemi. Thank you for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Hope to see you right here next time.